Thanks for joining today's webinar conversation on U.S. climate policy in 2021, what we can expect in the first year. My name is Eric Campbell. I'm an associate with Smart Prosperity Institute, a green economy think tank based at the University of Ottawa here in Canada. One of the things we do as an organization is operate this international research and policy network, which plugs Canada into the brightest thinking on the green economy worldwide. And we're really excited to be drawing on that network today by continuing this long-running collaboration with Duke University on this US-Canada climate policy series, and also drawing on our friends at Georgetown University. And the purpose of today's webinar is exactly that, to continue to reinforce the policy and research collaboration between Canada and the US. And today that means getting a lot of Canadians up to speed on what's happening and what's going to happen in the US. We as Canadians have a lot of questions and probably the same ones as a lot of Americans. And so today we're going to channel those questions through me, lucky Canada. Now, I also want to mention I'm the host of Smart Prosperity, the podcast, a bi-weekly podcast focused on current affairs in the green economy. And I mentioned that because we're going to be adapting this conversation, today's webinar conversation, for our next podcast, which is coming out next week. We're not going to use any of the content from the Q&A session, so don't let anything prevent you from asking your questions during the Q&A session. We are leaving aside some time for Q&A. I invite you to start posting your questions in the chat bar as we go. You'll see to the bottom right of your Zoom dashboard a Q&A button. You open that and you could begin asking any questions that come to mind over the course of our panel conversation. I also wanted to encourage you all, as you're asking your questions, please include your name and organization so it feels a bit more like we're in the same room together instead of separated by a border and not to mention a pandemic. Now, I'm excited to get to the hot topic we're covering today. What is the outlook for US climate policy in the first year of the Biden-Harris administration? It's made all the hotter since we learned the results of last week's Georgia runoffs, which now gives control of the Senate also to the Democrats, in addition to the House of Representatives, of course, to the presidency, and in addition to a number of states and cities at the subnational level that are eager for climate leadership. And I'm excited to introduce the three people who are going to help us tackle that today. Anna Unruh-Cohen is the staff director of the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. This is a special congressional committee appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, in 2019 to deliver ambitious climate policy recommendations to Congress. Anna has previous staff roles with the House of Representatives, the Senate, and also some time working with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thanks for joining, Anna. Second, I'm introducing Joe Kruger. Joe is the Policy and Strategy Director at the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown University. He too has an amazing depth of experience. He's worked at the state government level, also for the Bipartisan Policy Center, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and the Environmental Protection Agency, among others. Joe, thank you for joining.
Great to be with you.
And finally, Tim Profeta is the director of Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. He too has had staff roles in Congress, including being an environmental advisor to former Senator Joe Lieberman. Tim is also the co-chair of the Climate 21 project, which drew on 150 experts to produce a 300-page blueprint for the Biden administration on how to implement a whole of government response to climate change. Tim, finally, thank you for joining the podcast today.
It's a pleasure.
Tim, now maybe we can start with you. For people trying to wrap their heads around the Biden climate agenda, there's a lot to look at. There's a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. There's a $1.7 trillion clean energy and environmental justice plan. There are policy recommendations from a Unity task force, et cetera, et cetera. The first question on people's minds might be, how do we make sense of this agenda, and should we expect everything in those plans to get the administration's attention in 2021? What do you say to that?
Wow. I say there always is a schism between the ambition of a presidential campaign and what can be executed in once administration comes into governance. And I don't suspect this would be any different. However, I do think it's very clear that the ambitious climate plan of the Biden-Harris administration is one of the central foci of their administration. You look at the transition site, and for people like Anna and Joe and I have been working for a long time in the United States, to have one of the four priorities on the president-elect's transition site being the climate crisis is a change and a welcome one. And so I expect that level of ambition and priority will carry through. So the question will really be, how do they execute some of the ambition? I think the investment agenda, particularly in the infrastructure to make the transition, will likely be a very high priority in the legislative proposals I'm sure Anna will talk about. So that should find its way through. A lot of that should find its way through. The regulatory agenda will find its way through. But it'll be challenging across the board to both politically and, somebody just gave the metaphor. This is like the Lincoln Tunnel going to New York City. There's so much priorities and so little bandwidth. All these things are going to have to get through that tunnel to the other side and there's just a lot to do.
So in the interest of making the most of the time we have today, maybe we can start breaking it down by the pieces of the agenda that maybe rise to the top. Tim, for you, what's one piece of the climate agenda that you expect to get prioritized in the first year?
I'm gonna cheat a little bit on the answer to this question, because I think one of the things you're going to see right out of the gate, and so it's going to be some day one executive orders out of the Biden administration that will kind of frame a lot of what the president's agenda will be. I'd pick one which I expect that the White House will pursue a climate action plan 2.0 of some sort. So a whole of government approach, making sure they're using every lever within the power of the executive branch to try and move the country towards decarbonization. And I think that'll be a very important first 100-day priority to get that plan done well, so it then can dissipate through the entire executive branch.
Interesting. Anna, maybe to loop you in at this stage, before those Georgia runoffs, we were anticipating that executive powers might be the main way to advance the president's climate agenda. But of course, I believe Democratic control of the Senate changes that. What do you see as the role of the legislative branch in advancing the climate agenda in the next year?
Thanks for that question, Eric, and for the invitation. It's great to be with all the panelists and everybody joining, listening in as well. The Georgia election results were critical and gives Democratic control in the Senate, allows them to set the agenda at committees and what comes to the floor, which is absolutely critical. But it is 50-50 with Vice President Harris having to sit there to break ties potentially. So that's the narrowest of margin. The House margin majority for Democrats is also very narrow as well. So, the way our legislature works, that's going to require working across the aisle, or in the case of the House, putting things together that has the full support of the range of the Democratic caucus, which is broad. But that said, I think Congress will be looking to work in a complementary fashion with the executive branch, and working very closely with the Biden-Harris administration. So the things that they're able to do on the regulatory side under their existing authority, we can hopefully be moving things in Congress that complements that supports that invests in some of those programs, that provides financial incentives. So I think At the start of the Obama administration, there was a big legislative push that I was around for as well. And then we kind of switched to the executive branch. And I think that's not going to be the case. Right out of the gate, you'll see the Biden administration working closely with Congress. And in particular on what needs to be done to help decarbonize the electricity sector by 2035. That was, a major campaign promise of President, still just barely elect Biden, but hopefully I'll be able to switch to President Biden here shortly. And so I think that's going to be a top agenda of what does Congress need to do to help them meet that. And maybe we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, and it's a great leading answer. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about how you think that one agenda item to decarbonize the electricity sector by 2035, which was something that pops out of the climate plan. What is the dynamic between the president, between the White House and Congress on that? To what extent is Congress needed to move that agenda item forward?
I think, again, it's a place you're going to be seeing people or seeing Congress and the executive branch working in tandem. I think one of the early pieces of legislation that Congress will be working on will be an infrastructure package. And as part of that, there'll be investments in grid modernization, in electric vehicles, in other things that will help provide the investment that we need in, the really near term to unlock a bunch of the renewables and clean energy resources that we have in the U.S. and that we share, across the border with Canada. So that'll be one. And then, I expect at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we'll see, things happening there that hopefully will help advance that. And then Congress will be looking at other things they need to do, like potentially a clean energy standard and getting that in place. I mean, we have a lot of our investor-owned utilities have already made commitments, and even really some of our public sector utilities are advancing on clean energy as well. So Congress will be taking a hard look at that. Could be challenging to put together a bipartisan piece of legislation, but I think those are ongoing conversations, both up on Capitol Hill and in the White House very soon.
Thanks, Anna, and absolutely, let's circle back on that later on in the conversation. First, I'd like to hear from you, Joe. Joe, what do you think are some agenda items that rise to the top for implementation over the next year, or for advancing over the next year?
Well, I think one right off the bat, and we'll start on day one also, is that we talk a lot about Build Back Better as far as investing in clean energy. I think there's also a Build Back Better for human capital in the government, particularly in the executive branch. And so, we've had 4 years of aggressive rollbacks of climate programs and environmental programs, and really demoralization of executive branch staff, the career staff who are critical. Some good staff people have left. A lot have stayed, and I think they're dedicated and raring to go. But I think the new administration will need to invest in hiring some people and building up new initiatives. So I think can't underestimate the human aspect of it. And I also think, just sort of building on Tim and Anna's points, that state and local governments will have a big role on this too. And I think there will be some synergies, and you can envision, for example, big investment programs in infrastructure that Congress would pass on electric vehicle chargers, infrastructure, for example. coupled with regulatory standards on truck and car uh, uh, standards, and state and local initiatives on electric vehicles. So I think working in tandem, active processes within the federal government to include state and local governments, so that there's synergies as all those levels of governments go forward. I think we'll see a lot of that.
Thanks, Joe. Maybe picking up on your first point first on building back better on the human capital side. I noted that it was President Obama's top science advisor, John Holdren, who said that he thought Biden's most important early assignment is to return scientists and experts to government positions. How is that a fairly straightforward process? I mean, is that something that's done in the first month of a Biden presidency in terms of getting the right people back in charge of the right organizations, or is that a more difficult process?
Well, I think it's both a short-term and a longer-term process. That so far the appointees I've seen announced from the Biden administration have been excellent. I think he's going to bring in top people. He's going to bring in experts and top scientists to the different government agencies and to the White House, and so that's encouraging, and that can happen quickly. I think it's re-energizing the expertise that's already in some of the executive branch agencies. There are some great people there. They haven't been listened to for the last 4 years, but many of them are still there, sort of building internal task forces and agency initiatives that loop in those experts and those career people. And I think getting younger people to work in government again, hiring some top people at the career level and bringing them into the executive branch and government agencies. So I think all three of those things have to happen. And it's not overnight that you can sort of build staff back, particularly career staff. There's a process that it takes to hire people and so forth. But I think we will see steady progress over the first year.
Tim, this sounds like very similar to some of the recommendations that were made by the Climate 21 project. What are your thoughts on kind of that governance aspect and that human capital aspect?
I'm glad Joe mentioned the point, because I think it's completely true. It's one of the central challenges is that you have hollowed out government agencies and you have demoralized government employees right now. I think the administration's done a really impressive job, or I should say the transition's done a really impressive job prioritizing refilling these positions, getting leadership in for the first day into key roles across the government. It was a central focus of the transition, and we're just starting to see actually this week some of the real star power of the people who are being named to these roles, completely with the intent that they can hit the ground running as fast as possible on the climate issue, come next week. So I'm really very impressed with what they've done. But Joe's right. One of the things I think we've made a stress to people who are coming to administration is don't try and do everything at once, because you will demoralize the government employees all over again by overwhelming them with a lack of priority. You need to prioritize, figure out what the most important things are. So, I think they'll bring that lens to it as well. And then lastly, I think there's a real opportunity for the U.S. government here in the vacancies that are throughout the federal government, and it is that longer-term build of human capital. But there are innumerable positions for young, bright, ambitious people trying to solve the climate challenge in the federal government, coming into administration that's going to make it a central focus. So there's an ability really to build out broad capacity over the next year or two through those more traditional hiring processes to address this issue.
And we hope that they hire a lot of Duke and Georgetown students who are graduating.
I'm hearing some nods of agreement from our chat panel, from people who, or for somebody who works in one of those federal agencies. I'd like to move back onto those kind of big ticket items that are on the president's climate agenda. Anna, you mentioned a clean energy standard. Could you walk us through a little bit more what that might look like in the context of a Biden-Harris administration?
Sure. Well, those of you who read President-elect Biden's campaign materials closely will have seen that he proposed a combined clean energy and energy efficiency standard to decarbonize the U.S. electricity sector by 2035. That commitment to decarbonizing the electricity sector by 2035 carried through into his transition website as well. And so, there are actually a number of bills that have previously been introduced on a clean electricity standard in Congress, including one right at the end of the session last year from a bipartisan version in the House from Representative McKinley, who's a Republican from West Virginia, and Representative Schneider, who's a Democrat from Washington State. So there's at least some signal that you could proceed on a clean energy standard in a bipartisan way, which is really critical, especially in the Senate, if it were going to go through our traditional legislative process. For the last few years, the Senate has basically been working in a way that you have to achieve a supermajority to move legislation because of people invoking the filibuster that requires a 60-vote threshold to proceed. So I think there are conversations going on about, is there a clean energy standard that could be crafted to get 60 votes in the Senate? I think that remains to be seen. But certainly if you look at what's happening on the state level, and as I mentioned earlier with investor-owned utilities and their commitments, there is a reasonable, you could reasonably expect that you could craft one that would be bipartisan on the policy side of things. On the political side of things, it's probably harder, and getting to 60 votes in the Senate, remains a challenge. And so, there are additional mechanisms, something called reconciliation, which if our friends in Canada haven't heard about that, you probably will be hearing about that more. But it's a particular mechanism to get through the Senate with just a majority vote. It has a lot of rules around it. It has to primarily be focused on budget-related items. And so it's not exactly the most straightforward to move something like a clean energy standard through using reconciliation. But I think people are taking a look at what, if anything, might be viable there as a fallback position if a bipartisan approach isn't feasible. But that said, clean energy standard could be an important tool, but there are just a lot of other things that need to happen to help decarbonize the U.S. electricity sector that, can proceed, like investment in the grid, like potentially some reform at FERC. So I think there's a lot that can get us on the path to that decarbonization, even while there's ongoing discussions about a clean energy standard going forward. And I think you'll see both the Biden administration and the Congress trying to pursue some of those other complementary policies that are vital to decarbonizing electricity go forward, just as quickly as they can.
Thanks, Anna. I'm just going to take a moment to ask our participants, our audience, if you could please direct your questions to the Q&A bar rather than the chat bar. It just makes it easier for our staff to collect them and to filter through them. There's a lot of questions being shared right now in the chat bar, which are hard to keep track of, and we want to be able to get to as many of them as possible. Tim, back over to you for a moment. You know, Anna talked about, in spite of a Democratic majority in Congress, it's going to be tricky to move some of these pieces of legislation. Your opening point was around what could happen through executive action. Can you walk us through a little bit more what you expect over the first year to be moved through the executive branch exclusively?
Yeah, and it's not a short answer. Is the first thing. I think for the first time, and you can see it actually even in the nominees of the president-elect for the roles. There are climate champions in the Treasury Department, in the Agriculture Department, in the Energy Department, across the whole government, and there are levers that each of those authorities have to try and move us towards decarbonization that I would expect to be used aggressively. So it's not a short answer, but a couple of the key things I'd expect. I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, that the President Biden, I'm just going to say in future tense, President Biden will have to do is he will have to have a new NDC for Glasgow when we come back to the table in Paris. And I think that will have to happen in months, not years' time. So I think what we're going to really look at is like what I would call the investment agenda through Congress that Anna is describing, coupled with kind of a regulatory agenda using the pre-existing authorities to address climate, you know, carbon pollution in the United States through the executive branch. So the key agency will probably be the Environmental Protection Agency and its authorities under the Clean Air Act to both regulate the stationary sources, the smokestacks, and the vehicles. And I would expect quick rulemaking under those authorities to be a key priority of the administration. Then I also think there's going to be the other key effort will be sort of the economic policy coming out of the Treasury Department and thinking about how that investment is deployed in ways that's addressing bottlenecks in our transition to the decarbonized sector, and then other programs that have more of a partnership approach, like in the agricultural sector. You know, one thing that we're talking quite a bit about is whether things like the agriculture sector can create a carbon bank to create payment schemes for lower carbon agriculture. Lastly, this will probably come back to Anna's desk, but the idea of having a big infrastructure bank. One of the team members was just announced yesterday to the White House team, has worked at a Coalition Green Capital for years, talking about a national carbon infrastructure bank that would then flow through the states that Joe's are working with in all likelihood and really help target investments. So that's a longer answer, and again, but I think it's going to be a whole of government approach. So there's going to be something going on in Justice Department, and there's going to be something going on in the Defense Department on this as well. It will not just be kind of stovepiped into these key agencies.
Joe, I want to come back to the state level. Anna spoke about a clean energy standard, and I know that there is at least one state, to my knowledge, Massachusetts, but probably others that already have their own clean energy standard. And I'm curious about the dynamic between the federal and the state level over the next 4 years, and particularly in the next year. Of course, you know, during the Trump administration, it looked like states really embraced their jurisdiction related to climate with a little bit more enthusiasm. Is there a tension there now that the federal government is going to be showing climate leadership again on things like a clean energy standard?
No, I don't think there's a real tension. I mean, you know, across the government, there's always a certain amount of discussion as to what is the appropriate level of government to handle different issues, and it comes into play on climate policy as well. I think that in the past, when we talked about climate or energy policy, there was more discussion of possibly preempting state authorities. I think a lot of that is dissipated, and partly because some of the leading states have been the continuity in between kind of the pendulum of federal administrations who were active, then not active, then active again, then actively trying to roll things back. And so, throughout that time, leading states like California and many others have been trying new models and innovating and so forth. So I think I would like to hope that we've gotten past sort of the really tense state versus federal issues into a more collaborative approach. I know that a lot of the folks that are coming into the new administration, certainly Gene McCarthy, who's worked at the state level, both in Connecticut and Massachusetts, understand the importance of state level actions, and we'll try to look for these synergies. And the first part of your question about clean energy standards, I think more than 30 states have some sort of renewable portfolio standard or clean energy standard. And so that will certainly, to the extent that a federal CES goes forward, and we can sort of debate, whether that could get 60 votes or whether you could do it through reconciliation or whether that's going to happen. I think there will, by necessity, have to be a lot of coordination with the states, just because the state programs are all different from each other, much less from the national standard. And so trying to figure out how to make a national standard work with all those existing state programs going will be an effort.
Mm-hmm. Joe, what about transportation? This is that's an area where we saw some friction between the federal and state level under Trump. I'm thinking of the corporate average fuel economy standards, where California had a more advanced standard than the federal government. I'm especially interested because transportation is an area, at least in vehicle manufacturing, where there's a lot of integration between the Canadian and American economies. So what happens on transportation in the first year of a Biden-Harris administration?
Well, I don't have any inside knowledge, but what I would assume will happen is, first of all, there'll be efforts to sort of roll back the effort that started under the Trump administration to curtail the California waiver and also to roll back the Obama era standards. I would assume that the Biden administration will go beyond the Obama standards, and there will be a very aggressive approach to consistent with technology and cost to push those standards as far as possible, probably in concert with California and the leading states. And so I think that will be a real cornerstone of the administration's efforts.
Thanks, Joe. Anna, same question to you on transportation, which I'm not surprised that the panel has focused a lot on the electricity sector so far, because that, of course, is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. But transportation is close behind. What happens in the transportation sector in the first year under a Biden-Harris administration?
Well, transportation is critical, is now our number one sector for emissions. So we definitely have to focus on that. I think, again, Congress will probably be playing a complementary role to what the administration can do under their existing authority. So, both under the Clean Air Act and in the 2007 Energy Act, there's direction to the executive branch to be kind of maximizing fuel economy standards, and Congress will absolutely be willing to play a supportive role there if they need to be. As I mentioned before, I think we'll be trying to get more investment on electric vehicles and the infrastructure and other possible changes needed there to just help support that build out, both on passenger vehicles and also on heavier duty vehicles. mentioning heavy duty reminds me that, we do have a renewable fuel standard. And I think that may be an area that Congress takes another look at. Maybe not right out of the gate, but sometime this year, especially the possibility of transitioning to a low carbon fuel standard. But, I think for some of the heavier duty transportation needs, we obviously are still going to need some liquid fuels, and trying to figure out how to put those together or generate those that are lower emission will be really important.
Thanks, Anna. Tim, anything to add on to that?
Yeah, can I just speak that quickly? I just think talking about the transition in the transportation sector is, I think, a good illustration, as you heard described by my two colleagues, of how this is going to be a collaborative approach between these different areas of the U.S. government, because Joe and his colleagues at Georgetown are instrumental in creating something called a TCI, Transportation Climate Initiative in the Northeast, that extends up and down the East Coast, which is states thinking about what they need to decarbonize the sector. Also, the states are thinking a lot about what they need in infrastructure investment and are pushing forward electrification. You couple that with the executive branch's ability to create standards and drive the manufacturers to regulation towards higher fuel efficiency, with then the big stimulus infrastructure package that's likely going to be coming through Congress. And you can see how the three areas need to be collaborating and supporting each other. And I think that's kind of a good snapshot of how we see climate policy and climate ambition being sort of quarterbacked by the Biden administration. They have what they have in their own tools in their own hands. They have the investment agenda they'll likely be able to get through Congress. And then they have all these great leadership partners in the states that they don't want to preempt. They want to help keep running in the directions they are. And I think that's, across the sectors, you'll probably see very similar things, but I thought that was a good microcosm of the sort of the way it will be structured in all likelihood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tim. And for us Canadians, that sounds familiar. Transportation being an area of shared jurisdiction in Canada also. We want to get some Q&As now. I'm going to invite my colleague Stuart Elgie to give him first dibs on a question to the panelists. Stuart's also going to be closing out the webinar at the end with some observations on linkages with Canadian policy. But first, Stuart, over to you on a question for the panelists.
Thanks, Eric. I think I'm the token Canadian. I'm chair of Smart Prosperity Institute and Profit U of O, for those who don't know me. Boy, I've got about 10 questions, but I won't ask them all. I'd love more detail on industrial decarbonization, agriculture, clean fuel standard, because they're all areas where Canada's moving. And I'm really thinking, how could we work together with the US to do this jointly? But I guess and I also want to ask about border carbon adjustment, but I see that's in the Q&A, so I won't scoop that. So the one I want to ask about is Canada's main policy tool that we've used has been carbon pricing, and specifically a nationwide carbon tax, at least a minimum standard that provinces must come up to. And it's gone big, right? It's going up to $50 a ton by 22 and up to 170, 180 by 2030. So I guess my question really is, what are the prospects for the US moving on carbon pricing at the national level, not the state level, at the national level, whether it be tax or cap and trade? And if they don't move on pricing, then you got to go piece by piece, right? You've talked about industry and electricity. How are they going to deal with fuels more generally? Because to get at fuels, if you're not using pricing, you've got to use another mechanism. So they're going to move on pricing, and if not, how are they going to get at decarbonizing fuels?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab first. I really don't see carbon pricing as being one of the leading priorities out of the gate. That in the House Select Committee report, which I dropped in the chat, our Democratic members, indicated it's an important tool. We need to keep it on the table. We need to see how we might need to use it, but it's certainly moved from being kind of the primary policy objective. And increasingly we are, we're taking a look at the sectoral needs. That said, everywhere, including Canada, there's a carbon tax. There are also complementary policies. So I would say it's not off the table, but people, I think we're still trying to see how it might proceed given other policy avenues that are kind of on the front burner. And it's also, it's just politically challenging. So.
I'll agree with everything I just said. As somebody who's worked a lot on carbon pricing in the United States federal level in the past, it's not, it's not off the table, but it's not a high priority politically. I think the only thing I'd like to add to that's a little bit of a wrinkle from past is it's got political challenges now on both sides of the aisle in a way that it didn't before. There's a number of equity concerns about a pricing regime in the United States right now that would need to be addressed before really I think could come back to the table, and that's a conversation that's really ongoing.
We didn't answer your fuels question though with that. I mean, I think that's, one of the reasons that carbon pricing has shifted from a front burner issue in the US is because it's the strongest signal it sends is to the electricity sector, which is doing okay for us. And so we've always been more focused on other policy mechanisms like fuel economy standards, renewable fuels, as ways to address investment in transit, as ways to address what happens in the transportation sector. And there's a lot, I think, of thinking and willingness to spend money on the innovation side to help some of the developments of fuels that we'll need for, for flying, for planes in particular, but also for shipping and some of the other heavier duty vehicles as well.
Okay, and to conclude, I'd like to turn us over to Stuart Elgee. As I mentioned, this webinar is part of an ongoing, it's the revival of something that we hope will be ongoing, a US-Canada climate policy series. And so, the obvious question, which has already come up in the chat bar is, okay, what are the Canadian linkages? What are the implications for Canada? And Stuart, you have all of a few minutes to tackle all of those questions. Over to you.
No problem. I'll pass the buck a little bit by saying those of you who are really keen on this, the good news is we will have Tim Profeta up here next year as our Fulbright visiting chair. And so you can ask him directly once we're allowed to cross the border again physically. But in Tim's absence, I'll try in 3 minutes to summarize all the implications for Canada. So for the American folks on the line, Canada has done a lot of stuff on climate policy in the last 4 years, probably as much as any nation in the world. Everything we've talked about today has happened to some degree in Canada, or is in part of the plan. So let me give 5 lightning round points and go real fast. So the biggest point is this, that the US moving raises the bar on Canada's potential level of ambition because it removes the biggest pushback, which is that our major trading partner is not imposing those same climate costs on its industries, so we can't go too far. As the US moves, the ability for Canada to move with it goes higher and higher, so that's great. Second point, there are some things that are hard for Canada to do alone. Biggest example is vehicles, which is of course a North American market. As the US moves on vehicles, we can raise our ambition, but similarly for industrial regulation, agriculture, clean fuel standard, those are really things that we can do more if we're working in tandem with our major trading partner. So it's a chance to work together in a way we haven't been able to do for 4 years. I think the biggest challenge will be carbon pricing because Canada's used that as the major tool in its toolbox to get there. The US won't. What it'll mean practically is we're going to have to look at, if the US isn't putting an explicit price on its industries, what implicit price is it putting on through its regulations? And as long as those prices are in the same ballpark, that's fine. We can use different policy instruments and we're not hurting our competitiveness. And again, it unleashes Canada's ability to get tough on climate without worrying about hurting our industries, such as oil and gas or heavy manufacturers. I think the border carbon adjustment, even if it's not going to be an issue in the first year, will become one. I wouldn't be surprised if the US wants to use that to deal with China and Asia. Canada cannot go it alone as a border carbon adjustment, but if the US does it, we may well want to go with them. And lastly, I think the thing we haven't talked as much about is not just the reducing emissions side of the equation, but the capturing economic opportunity side. You know, this isn't just a climate transition, it's an economic transition. And we've heard hints that the US is going to be throwing a lot of money at infrastructure and innovation. Canada needs to think about how we can be part of that value chain. We really are, for most industries, integrated in a north-south way, not just at the R&D side, but at the industrial deployment side. And if the US is going to be moving ahead on industry, heavy industry, vehicles, buildings, fuels, we want to think about everything from our research labs to our deployment and R&D with our big industries, how we can work together on that. And if the US is going to use a big economic stimulus package to help support that, it really strengthens the case for a big green economic stimulus package in Canada coming out of the recession too. So lots of opportunities for working together, but overall it raises the bar on Canada's ability to go big because we're not going to get undercut by our largest trading partner.
Thank you, Stuart. And you get the last word. I want to thank everybody for participating. First and foremost, our panelists, Anna, Tim, and Joe, Stuart, and Brian. Thank you to Duke University and Smart Prosperity Institute at University of Ottawa, of course, for being partners in advancing today's webinar. And thank you for all our participants for tuning in. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all your questions. There's obviously a lot of interest and a lot of questions moving forward. But in the meantime, I think I speak for many of us that we look forward to next Wednesday, to Inauguration Day, and to ongoing policy collaborations between Canada and the US. So with that, I'd like to adjourn the webinar. Thanks to everybody for tuning in.